The heavy mahogany doors of the Blackthorne estate swung open, not for a high society gala, but for a woman whose presence silenced the room like a sudden winter frost. Soraya Cairo stood in the center of the grand foyer, her worn denim jacket and mud-stained backpack acting as a defiant smudge against the polished marble and gold leaf frames. Beside her stood Valor, Nova, and Aries, 3 toddlers with curly hair and their father's piercing eyes, clinging to her hands like small, brave soldiers. 3 years ago, Soraya had been chased into the rain by a mother-in-law who called her trash, but today she returns as a fortress. In the background, billionaire CEO Rowan Blackthorne sits frozen in his tailored navy suit, the air leaving his lungs as he stares at the triplets he never knew existed. But the real shock comes when the formidable Genevieve Ashford drops to her knees, her elegant pearls rattling as she clasps her hands in a desperate, weeping plea for forgiveness. What could make a billionaire matriarch beg the homeless girl she once destroyed? Watch until the very end to see the shocking secret Soraya reveals that turns this empire upside down. If you love stories of high-stakes revenge and emotional redemption, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this unfolding war. The scent of expensive lilies in the Ashford Blackthorne mansion always made Soraya feel like she was standing in a funeral home, waiting for her own burial. 3 years ago, on a night where the sky had finally broken open in a cold, relentless downpour, that burial became a reality. Rowan had been in Tokyo closing a merger, leaving Soraya alone in the cavernous house that never felt like home. She had been married to him for 6 months, a charity case in the eyes of the staff, and a stain on the lineage in the eyes of Genevieve Ashford. The confrontation hadn't happened in a boardroom or a dark alley, but in the nursery Soraya had been secretly painting. Genevieve had entered like a predator, her heels clicking against the hardwood with a lethal rhythm. She didn't raise her voice. Women of her stature didn't need to. She simply handed Soraya a suitcase packed with the few rags she had owned before Rowan found her. Genevieve told her that Rowan's love was a temporary madness, a phase that had reached its expiration date, and that a divorce was already being processed in his absence. When Soraya tried to speak, to tell her she was carrying Rowan's children, Genevieve's eyes turned to ice. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound, and told Soraya that a homeless girl's word would never stand against the Ashford name. She was accused of being a gold digger, a liar, and a mistake that needed to be erased before the morning sun. Without a phone, without money, and with the security team looming like shadows in the hallway, Soraya was escorted to the gates. The rain was so heavy it felt like stones hitting her skin. As the iron gates clicked shut behind her, Soraya stood on the muddy shoulder of the road, her hands instinctively clutching her stomach where 3 lives were just beginning to take shape. She had watched the lights of the mansion fade into the mist, realizing then that Rowan wasn't coming to save her. He was part of the world that had just spat her out. That night, the girl who believed in fairy tales died in the mud, and the woman who would do anything to protect her children was born. She walked for miles until her shoes fell apart, the cold soaking into her bones, fueling a fire that would take 3 years to turn into the icy resolve she carried today. The silence in the living room was so heavy it felt physical, broken only by the rhythmic, shallow breathing of 3 small children who had no idea they were standing in their father's kingdom. Rowan Blackthorne remained paralyzed in his chair, his gaze fixed on the trio. In the soft light of the chandelier, the resemblance was undeniable, a biological signature written in the shape of their brows and the defiant set of their jaws. He looked at Valor, who stood at the front with a protective stance far too mature for a 3-year-old, then at Nova and Aries, whose wide, curious eyes mirrored the very soul Rowan had seen in the mirror every morning of his life. The air in the room seemed to thin as Rowan finally stood, his legs feeling like lead. For 3 years he had lived with the lie that Soraya had vanished by choice, leaving him for a life she preferred over their marriage. Now the truth was looking back at him with his own eyes. He took a hesitant step forward, but Soraya immediately shifted, her body becoming a shield between him and the triplets. The movement was instinctive, a reflex born from years of being the only wall between these children and a world that didn't want them. Rowan's voice was a ragged whisper when he finally spoke, the name Soraya, catching in his throat like a shard of glass. He searched her face for a flicker of the warmth they once shared, but he found only the cold, hard surface of a woman who had survived a war he didn't even know was being waged. As his eyes traveled back to the children, he saw the small, worn backpacks they carried, the only estates they truly owned. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. While he had been expanding his billions, his own blood had been wearing hand-me-downs and sleeping in shelters. Valor stepped forward an inch, his small hand gripping Soraya's denim jacket tighter, his gaze never wavering from the tall stranger in the suit. In that look, Rowan saw more than just a likeness. He saw the judgment of a son he had never held. The billionaire CEO, a man who could command markets with a single word, was suddenly reduced to a spectator in his own home, realizing that while he held the wealth, these four people held the only thing that truly mattered, and they were there to give it all back to him in the form of a signed divorce decree. Soraya did not wait for the apology she knew would be hollow, nor did she wait for Rowan to find his voice. With a steady hand, she reached into the side pocket of her weathered backpack and pulled out a manila envelope. The paper was crisp, a sharp contrast to her frayed cuffs. She stepped forward, ignoring the way Genevieve's weeping face tracked her every move, and laid the documents on the heavy oak coffee table. The title, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage, stared up at Rowan like a death warrant for the life he thought he could reclaim. Rowan finally moved, his fingers trembling as he touched the edge of the paper. He didn't look at the signatures, he looked at Soraya. He began to speak of a trust fund, of a settlement that would put her and the children in a penthouse by nightfall, and of a monthly allowance that would make the last 3 years of poverty seem like a bad dream. He spoke as a CEO, attempting to buy his way out of the crushing guilt radiating from his chest. But Soraya's laughter, quiet and dry, cut him off before he could reach the numbers. She told him clearly that she wasn't there for a payout. She didn't want the Blackthorne name, she didn't want the Ashford jewels, and she certainly didn't want a settlement that would act as hush money for the night she was discarded. Her terms were terrifyingly simple. She wanted the divorce finalized within 24 hours, and she wanted a clause stating that the Blackthorne family would have no legal claim over Valor, Nova, or Ares. She was offering him the one thing he had always protected, his freedom, in exchange for her own. Genevieve let out a strangled gasp from her place on the floor, realizing that Soraya was doing the unthinkable. She was walking away from a billion-dollar legacy without taking a single cent. To a woman like Genevieve, money was the only language of power, but Soraya was speaking in a dialect of dignity that the Ashfords couldn't comprehend. Soraya made it clear that her children had been raised on love and struggle, and they didn't need the toxic air of a mansion to grow. She wasn't there to negotiate, she was there to serve an ultimatum. If Rowan didn't sign, she would take the story of the abandoned triplets to the one place the Blackthorns feared more than poverty, the court of public opinion. She gave him one look as cold and unrelenting as the rain she had once walked through, and waited for the stroke of a pen that would prove her worth was something they could never afford to buy. As Soraya turned to gather the triplets, ready to leave the suffocating opulence behind forever, Genevieve's voice cracked through the room, no longer a plea but a desperate confession. The matriarch remained on her knees, her face pale as she revealed the shadow that had been looming over the Blackthorne empire. It wasn't just guilt that had brought her to the floor. It was the cold, hard reality of the Ashford family trust, a legal iron cage designed by Rowan's late grandfather to ensure the purity and continuity of their bloodline. Genevieve explained, her voice trembling with a mixture of shame and urgency, that a hidden legacy clause existed within the foundational documents of their multi-billion-dollar holdings. The clause dictated that if the head of the house failed to produce and acknowledge a legitimate heir within 7 years of marriage, the entirety of the Ashford Blackthorne assets, the mansions, the tech conglomerates, the very ground they stood on, would be liquidated and diverted to a rival branch of distant, estranged cousins. To the world, the Blackthorns were untouchable, but behind the scenes, they were months away from a total financial collapse. For 3 years, Genevieve had lived in a state of silent panic, believing Rowan was childless and their legacy was dead. She had spent millions trying to find a way around the clause, only to realize the legal knots were tied too tight. Now, standing before her were 3 living, breathing solutions to their ruin. Valor, Nova, and Ares weren't just the children Rowan never knew. They were the only legal bridge left to save the Blackthorne name from being erased. The irony was a bitter pill that Genevieve was forced to swallow in front of the woman she had once deemed disposable. If Soraya walked out that door with those divorce papers signed and no formal recognition of the children as Ashford heirs, the family would be stripped of everything by the end of the quarter. The billionaire CEO and his formidable mother would be the ones facing the streets they had so callously pushed Soraya onto. Genevieve begged Soraya to understand that she wasn't just asking for forgiveness for her soul, she was begging for the survival of their world. But as Soraya looked at the woman who had valued a bloodline over a human life, her expression remained as unyielding as stone. The very system Genevieve had used to oppress Soraya had now become the noose around her own neck. The heavy, stifling silence of the Ashford Blackthorne mansion was broken only by the sound of Genevieve's ragged sobs. The woman who had once loomed over Soraya like an untouchable goddess was now reduced to a crumpled figure on the floor, her manicured fingers catching on the hem of Soraya's worn jeans. This was the public plea Genevieve had spent a lifetime avoiding. A raw, humiliating display of vulnerability in front of the staff, her son, and the woman she had tried to erase. She stayed on her knees, her head bowed, finally realizing that the powerless girl she had exiled now held the keys to the kingdom. Genevieve's voice was barely a whisper as she begged Soraya not to sign the papers, her words tumbling out in a frantic stream of regret and calculation. She spoke of the legacy that would vanish, the charity foundations that would shudder, and the thousands of employees who would lose their livelihoods if the triplets weren't acknowledged as the rightful heirs. But beneath the corporate panic, there was a flicker of something more human. A grandmother's desperate, belated realization that she had thrown away her own flesh and blood for the sake of a pride that was now eating her alive. Soraya looked down at the woman, her expression unreadable. For 3 years she had dreamed of this moment, of seeing the mighty Genevieve Ashford humbled. But as she watched the older woman tremble, Soraya felt no rush of triumph, only a deep, hollow exhaustion. She looked at Valor, Nova, and Ares, who were watching the scene with wide, uncomprehending eyes. They didn't see a billionaire matriarch. They saw a sad, broken lady on the floor. Soraya realized that Genevieve wasn't just begging for the money. She was begging for a chance to exist in the same world as these children, a world she had forfeited the night she chose gold over grace. Rowan stepped forward, his hand hovering near his mother's shoulder, but he didn't help her up. He was watching Soraya, waiting for the verdict that would determine if his family would be rebuilt or finally dismantled. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The living room, once a courtroom where Soraya was sentenced to poverty, was now the stage for Genevieve's ultimate penance. Soraya finally spoke, her voice calm and cold, telling Genevieve that a legacy clause might save a bank account, but it couldn't buy back the 3 years of hunger, cold, and silence. She didn't tell her to get up. She simply watched as the weight of 3 years of rain finally crushed the woman who had started the storm. Rowan Blackthorne finally moved, but it wasn't to comfort the woman weeping at his feet. It was to step away from her, as if the proximity to his own mother had suddenly become toxic. For years he had operated under the assumption that Genevieve was the guardian of the family's dignity, the one who kept the Blackthorne name pristine while he built the empire. He had lived with the guilt of Soraya's disappearance, haunted by the belief that she had simply grown tired of his world. But as he looked at Genevieve, kneeling, trembling, and confessing to a legal scheme that prioritized bank accounts over human lives, the veil finally shredded. He looked at Soraya, seeing for the first time the scars of the struggle he had allowed to happen. He realized that his conflict was nothing compared to her survival. He had been a coward, hiding behind his work and his mother's cold efficiency, never once questioning the narrative Genevieve had spun about the night Soraya left. He had let the woman he loved be hunted out of his own home because he was too busy being a king to be a husband. The realization was a jagged blade, cutting through his pride until nothing was left but a devastating, hollow shame. Rowan turned back to Genevieve, his voice low and vibrating with a fury that silenced her sobs. He didn't yell. The intensity of his disappointment was louder than any shout. He told her that she hadn't just protected the legacy, she had poisoned it. He realized that every dollar in their accounts was stained by the 3 years his children had spent in the cold. He looked at the legacy clause she feared so much and told her that he would rather see every Ashford Blackthorne building crumble to dust than use his children as pawns to save her social standing. For the first time in his life, Rowan didn't look at his mother for approval. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who was finally waking up to the monster he had let lead him. He told her to get up not because he was forgiving her, but because her kneeling was just another performance. A final, desperate attempt to manipulate the situation. Rowan then turned to Soraya, his posture breaking for a moment as he faced the weight of his own failure. He didn't ask for her hand, he didn't even ask for a second chance. He simply stood between his mother and his family, finally acting as the shield he should have been 3 years ago. The awakening was brutal and late, but as he looked at Valor, Nova, and Ares, he knew that the man he used to be had to die so that their father could finally stand a chance at existing. Soraya watched the man she once loved find his spine, but his awakening was a currency that had long since devalued in her world. She did not soften as Rowan stood between her and his mother. Instead she stepped around him, maintaining the distance she had spent 3 agonizing years building. Genevieve had finally stood up, her face a mask of ruined makeup and desperate hope, but Soraya's gaze remained as sharp and clinical as a surgeon's blade. She knew that in this house forgiveness was usually bought and sold, but today the price would be something the Blackthornes had never truly surrendered: their carefully curated image. Soraya's voice was steady, cutting through the heavy air with the weight of a final judgment. She told them that if they wanted her to even consider the legal acknowledgement required to save their empire, she would not be silenced by a private check or a non-disclosure agreement. Her first condition was a public reckoning. She demanded a full, televised apology from Genevieve Ashford herself, not just to Soraya, but a public admission of the cruelty and classism that had driven a pregnant woman onto the streets. She wanted the world to see the rot behind the golden gates, forcing the matriarch to dismantle the very reputation she had spent a lifetime protecting. Her second condition was a total restructuring of the family trust. Soraya wasn't interested in being a wealthy socialite. She demanded that a massive portion of the Ashford Blackthorne assets be diverted into a permanent foundation for homeless mothers and children, managed not by the family, but by an independent board of her choosing. She wanted the money that had been used as a weapon against her to become a shield for others. Valor, Nova, and Ares would be recognized as heirs, but their inheritance would be locked in a way that Genevieve could never use as leverage again. The room grew cold as the magnitude of her demands settled. For Genevieve, a public apology was a fate worse than poverty. It was social suicide. For Rowan, it meant admitting to his shareholders and his peers that he had been a puppet to his mother's malice. Soraya gave them no room for negotiation. She told them they had 1 hour to decide if their pride was worth more than their fortune. She wasn't asking for a seat at their table. She was telling them she was the one who owned the table now. As she gathered her children to wait in the foyer, she left them with a final, chilling truth. She had survived with nothing, so she had nothing left to fear, while they were about to find out exactly how little they were without their names. The atmosphere of the mansion shifted from a family standoff to a battlefield when the heavy silence was punctured by the arrival of Alistair Thorne, the Blackthorne's most ruthless corporate rival. Having caught wind of the internal chaos and the presence of the homeless girl, through a leaked security feed, Alistair entered the foyer with a smirk that felt like a predatory baring of teeth. He didn't come to offer comfort, he came to scavenge. He saw the tension as a freight train of opportunity to dismantle Silvio's, or in this case Rowan's, organization. To Alistair, Soraya was merely a tool, a witness to be used as leverage to trigger a hostile takeover while the Blackthorne name was at its weakest. He approached Soraya with a practiced oily charm, offering her a check that dwarfed anything Rowan had suggested. He spoke of justice and revenge, promising to put her on every news cycle to ensure Genevieve Ashford never showed her face in high society again. He painted a picture of a massive arms shipment of scandal that would sink the Blackthorne ships and leave him in control of the wreckage. He expected the woman in the denim jacket to jump at the chance to destroy the people who had hurt her, assuming her poverty made her easy to buy. But Alistair had made the same mistake Genevieve once had. He underestimated the wisdom from the streets. Soraya didn't look at the check. She looked at him with a gaze that had survived much darker alleys than a corporate boardroom. She realized that while Genevieve was a monster of pride, Alistair was a monster of greed who would treat her children as mere line items on a balance sheet. She stepped forward, her presence filling the room with a cold, untouchable dignity. In a voice that was tense, cinematic, and gritty, Soraya dismantled him. She told Alistair that she might be done with the Blackthornes, but she would never be a weapon for a man who viewed people as assets to be liquidated. She revealed that she had already recorded his attempt to suborn a legal witness and that if he didn't leave her kingdom immediately, She would ensure he was the one facing a cleaning house of legal ramifications. The triplets stood behind her, a small, silent wall of defiance that made the billionaire rival look suddenly small and insignificant. Rowan watched from the shadows, realizing that Soraya was doing more than protecting herself. She was protecting the legacy for the sake of the children, proving she was the only one with the selfless bravery to lead it. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was the cleaning house. Alistair retreated, his smirk replaced by a shivering realization that he had just tried to bully a queen. Soraya turned back to the room, the threat no longer a future possibility, but a settled debt. She had protected the pride not for the name but for her own blood. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of the Blackthorne estate, but it no longer felt like a cold, untouchable tomb. The transformation was complete. The cleaning house had been finished and a new order was established. Soraya stood in the center of the room, no longer a thin, shivering girl, but a woman who had successfully navigated a high-level war and emerged as the victor. The divorce papers were signed, but they were no longer a weapon of destruction. They were the foundation of a restructured empire where power was no longer measured solely by fear or heritage. Genevieve Ashford had delivered her public apology, her pride dismantled in a freight train of realizations that had finally cracked her emotional armor. She remained in the peripheral of their lives, a ghost from the past, learning to exist in a world where she was no longer the one pulling the strings. Rowan had stepped down as CEO to oversee the new foundation for the displaced, finally listening to those he had once deemed powerless. He and Soraya remained separate, their romantic past a closed chapter, yet they were united by a possible path of redemption as they co-parented the triplets. Valor, Nova, and Ares ran across the manicured lawns, their laughter a cinematic contrast to the heavy silence that had once defined the property. They were the true heirs not just of a fortune, but of a mother's selfless bravery, and a father who had finally learned the wisdom from the streets. Soraya moved into her own power, managing the foundation with a methodical and patient hand that mirrored the strength she had gained during her years of hardship. She had taken the wisdom from the streets and turned it into a kingdom of her own making, proving that true power comes from protection, not oppression. As Soraya looked back at the mansion one last time before heading to her own home, she felt a genuine sense of hope for redemption. The cycle of cruelty was broken. The billionaire CEO, the humbled matriarch, and the resilient mother had moved from a tense mystery to a settled peace. She had arrived as a beggar and left as an architect, having built a new empire where the cold nature of the past was replaced by a future defined by dignity. The story that began with a screaming warning ended with the quiet, triumphant hum of a family and a legacy that was finally truly healed.